Improvise, adapt, and overcome.
Welcome to the Sit Rep edition of the Carry On podcast for the week of May 29th. I am your host, as always, Brad Colbert, the Iceman. And continued apologies for the disrupted schedule as much of my team is traveling at the moment. Continued thanks goes to all of you who have commented on the show, and I read almost all of your messages across the platforms and try to answer most of them. If I haven't responded to your specific email or comment, I assure you it's on the way. I also deeply respect your support and this conversation. The platform is enjoyable. I hope it's enjoyable for you. And I hope to keep it going with accurate analysis and interviews. Coming up, we are doing another AMA next week. So if you have questions, by all means, get them in. We're going to answer them as well, honestly, as I possibly can. Any question, there's nothing off limits. As well as some interviews with folks in the studio that I know you will enjoy. As I mentioned previously, we're going to have Tony Espera from Generation Kill here. We also are going to have another guest that will be revealed later, an interesting author, a good friend of mine as well. Before we dive into the show, let me thank two individuals, Jenny and Bruce, who decided to level up their support on Patreon, and we'll be getting a signed photo as well as some other goodies. Jenny, Bruce, thank you both. I appreciate that level of support. This evening will be more in keeping with our normal routine of around an hour, maybe a little bit longer, but not the extended versions of the last few weeks. So don't pour as much into your glass tonight as you may have the past couple. 2 fingers should suffice. And this is where you would say phrasing. I want to begin by talking about the civil war taking place in Sudan and the addition of drones in that civil war. I'd say get used to that tagline because it's going to be the new norm for combat moving forward. I want to then share with you 3 news stories surrounding firearms in America-ish. Yeah, it's kind of going to be a theme for this week's show. So if that's not your bag, I apologize. I think you know me well enough to know I talk about a diverse group of subjects, anything that interests me, anything that I feel should be interesting to you, and I try to give it to you in plain language and as much factual knowledge as I can to allow you to frame an opinion. And to that end, what I'd like to do in the future, I think, is unpack some myths about firearm ownership in America and some of the legislation and the history surrounding it, but not tonight. No. I also know that the Second Amendment is a massive wedge in this country, and not just here, as the rest of the world enjoys weighing in on American amendments as well, specifically the second. We'll save that for another time. So without further ado, drink in hand, let's begin, shall we? So the Civil War in Sudan, I'll talk to you a little bit about the historical roots, and then I'm going to explain how they have very recently added drones into the mix with some pretty catastrophic results. Sudan's currently engaged in a civil war. It has been going on for a while. In fact, it's been going on since April 15th of 2023. That is when fighting broke out between the Sudanese armed forces. We will refer to them as SAF, S-A-F. They are led by a General Al-Burhan, and the Rapid Support Forces, or SF. They are led by Dagalo, sometimes also known as Hemedti. Now, the RSF is a very powerful Sudanese paramilitary group currently fighting the Sudanese armed forces for control of the country. But I know I said it started in 2023, but the fuse for this conflict was laid out long before 2023. The RSF did not appear out of nowhere. It grew out of militia networks called a Janjaweed, used by the Sudanese state during the Darfur War back in the 2000s. Now, those networks were later formalized into the RSF, given money, given weapons, a lot of autonomy, and eventually national political relevance. Sudan's state created this monster to fight its peripheral wars. Then the monster got rich, got foreign backing, got drones, and decided it did not need to stay subordinate. By this year, drones have become one of the war's defining instruments. The United Nations human rights officials reported that drones accounted for about 80% of conflict related civilian deaths in Sudan in the first 4 months of this year alone, killing at least 880 people, with most recorded in Kordofan. Now, the deeper historical terrain Sudan has been engaged in, I suppose, has been pretty unstable since independence in 1956 because its political center repeatedly treated the periphery as a security problem rather than a national community. And this formula we have seen play out in many countries around the world. When the majority excludes the minority does not stay silent for very long. And in this case, it hasn't. Power is concentrated around Khartoum and riverine elites. The peripheral regions like South Sudan, Darfur, the Blue Nile, South Kordofan, Eastern Sudan were marginalized politically and economically. So the old Sudanese state survived through this reoccurring formula. You control the capital, militarize the margins, buy off commanders, punish rebellions, and keep the state's spoils flowing upward. Now, that formula produced repeated civil wars. The North-South civil wars eventually led to South Sudan's independence in 2011. But the logic that produced those wars did not disappear. It remained inside Sudan's political architecture. The Darfur War is the key predecessor to the current conflict, and I think the one that most of us are familiar with in recent history. So in the early 2000s, Darfuri rebels accused Khartoum of discrimination and neglect. So the government responds with army, intelligence services, and Arab militia forces, commonly known as the Janjaweed. So those militia networks were accused of mass atrocities, a lot of ethnic cleansing, and again, this is the horror stories that we have heard come out of Darfur, and war crimes. Hamedi's power base grew out of that ecosystem. So that's the first major point. The RSF is not just a paramilitary force. It is Darfur's counterinsurgency architecture, which has since turned into a national political actor. So Omar al-Bashir ruled Sudan from 1989 to 2019. And he is very similar to a lot of authoritarian rulers. He deliberately prevented any single institution from becoming strong enough to overthrow him. So that meant he balanced the army, the intelligence service, the radical Islamist cadres, the tribal militias, and the paramilitary forces. He pitted them all against one another. That kept Bashir alive politically for decades, but it also hollowed out the country. The RSF was formally organized in the 2010s and became more than a Darfur militia. It guarded borders, fought in Yemen alongside the Gulf-backed coalitions. It controlled gold networks, and it did build a lot of direct foreign relations. So it had a diplomatic wing, I guess you would say. Now, Hamedi became very wealthy, very politically consequential. His forces became loyal to him personally, not to any kind of constitutional chain of command. So Bashir's regime creates Sudan's fatal contradiction, if you will. You have two coercive centers all inside one state, SAF, RSF. The SAF, which is their standing army, has formal legitimacy, a lot of heavy weapons. As you would expect, they have a command structure because they are a state-sponsored military, or they are the state's military. And they have a state identity, uniforms and enlistments and training protocols and budgets and all of that. Contrast that with the RSF, which has a high degree of mobility, a lot of money, a decent amount of patronage, and combat experience, a lot of tribal networks, gold-linked finance, and the aforementioned foreign relationships. Now, that relationship that I'm describing, it can't hold on forever. So, 2019, popular protests helped remove Bashir, but the revolution did not dismantle the military security economy. It removed the president, but it left the armed power structure largely intact. The civilians pushed for a democratic transition. The army and RSF positioned themselves as guardians of order. Kind of a junta, if you will. Burhan and Hamedi, they did sit together at the top of Sudan's post-Bashir military council. That alliance was very transactional, was not stable, and the central unresolved question was very, very simple. Who controls the guns? The civilian transition required integrating the RSF into the army. Hamedi knew integration would mean complete loss of his autonomy. All of his forces would be rolled up under the state's army, and he would lose his position, control. He knew leaving the RSF independent meant the army was no longer the state's supreme force. It wasn't just that he wanted to maintain his position and his power. He did not want the army to be the sole power without any check and balance. The political negotiation really became this big countdown clock. 2021 military coup further derails any transition that would have taken place. Afterwards, the SAF and RSF both claimed to protect Sudan while separately preparing for an inevitable confrontation, which by early 2023 happened. The dispute over RSF integration timelines, command authority, political control, it eventually breaks down and becomes completely irreconcilable. This is my first one of the evening, I assure you. In April of 2023, the system completely breaks. The war starts as a fight for command of the state, talking about Khartoum, airports, bases, presidential sites, media infrastructure, and a lot of command nodes. But it quickly metastasized. This is a pretty good story separately when you look at the evacuation of the embassy in Khartoum. The American U.S. Department of State had an embassy there. Their exfiltration from that capital is an interesting story. Probably worth a separate look, just how you had separate Americans in these pockets around the capital, how to bring them all together while navigating RSF and SAF checkpoints. Eventually, they were taken out by helicopter, but it took several days. No casualties, but they did get shot at a lot. Anyways, the RSF used mobility and urban infiltration to seize or at least contest a lot of the large parts of Khartoum. The SAF has air power, artillery, and a lot of institutional control. Both sides treated civilian space as a battlefield. Khartoum, capital city, became a city of checkpoints, looting, shelling, siege conditions, and a lot of displacement, as you would expect. Urban combat is never pretty, and it's the hardest on civilians. Refugee lines get mixed into battlefield lines, and it doesn't end well. Darfur became even worse. RSF and a lot of allied militias expanded control across much of that region. El Fashir, the last major Darfur city held by SAF-aligned forces for a very long period, became a central objective. Reuters reported survivor accounts after the RSF attack on El Fashir, including starvation, killings, torture, looting, and drone strikes, all during the escape from the city. This is where this war's historical memory matters. Darfur is not just another front, it is the origin ground of the RSF. It is also the place where Sudan's old militia logic is really the most lethal. Sudan sits in a very strategic corridor. It has the Red Sea, Horn of Africa, Sahel, the Nile Basin, Gulf interests, gold routes, migration routes, and food security corridors. Now, that geography guarantees foreign attention. The SAF has been linked in reporting to support streams involving countries such as Egypt, Iran, Turkey, and many others. The RSF has been repeatedly linked by Sudanese officials, as well as rights groups and investigative reporting, to Gulf-centered support allegations, especially involving the UAE, which denies arming the RSF. I cannot approve it nor deny it. Reuters has reported Sudanese accusations against the UAE and Ethiopia, all related to drone attacks. Ethiopia has rejected it, of course. UAE denies involvement. And really, the key is not just who denies what. The key is that Sudan's war is now dependent on a lot of external supply chains. It has to come from somewhere. The drones, the guided munitions, the technicians, mercenaries, satellite intelligence, and money. It's all oxygen that's fueling this conflict, and a lot of it is flowing in from outside. The Associated Press reported that Human Rights Watch has accused UAE of training and deploying Colombian mercenaries to support the RSF, including assistance connected to drone operations. UAE and associated entities have completely denied involvement. Not surprised. So where do drones enter this picture? Well, the drones have become, or I should say became, decisive because Sudan's war created the exact conditions where drones thrive. You have a very fluid front line. Air defenses are uneven. Civilian and military infrastructure are mixed. You have a lot of dispersed command nodes. Foreign patrons can ship parts and systems completely deniably. Both sides need reach without risking pilots. And lastly, the state. The state is really too weak to control its own airspace. The SAF uses drones to compensate for difficult ground maneuver and to strike RSF positions, as well as their logistics and suspected support sites. On the other side, RSF uses drones to compensate for its lack of a conventional air force. It's becoming a very popular play, quite frankly. Reuters verified satellite imagery, which shows RSF operating suspected Chinese-made CH-95 drones from South Darfur with Jane's, which is a major defense think tank, publication, information. We've all Jane's books, right? Jane's has assessed the CH-95 is capable of long-range surveillance and strike missions. This is all historically significant, I feel. A militia born from state-backed counterinsurgency now operates like a quasi-air force. Before drones, Sudan's geography at least gave each side some sanctuary. The army had Port Sudan and much of the east. The RSF had strength in Darfur and parts of Kordofan. So that distance really matters. Drones have compressed the map. In May of last year, RSF drones hit Port Sudan. They targeted fuel depots, the container terminal, as well as an electricity substation. They also hit areas near government facilities. Reuters reported that the attacks caused major fires and a citywide power outage. A lot of that is threatening aid. because a lot of that aid delivery goes right through Sudan's main humanitarian gateway. All of this changes the war's meaning. Port Sudan was supposed to be the SAF-aligned government's rear base. Drone strikes have turned it into a reachable target. Now, that same shift is also visible in Kordofan. Reuters reported that escalating drone strikes and new deployments by both sides shows that Kordofan had become the center of a lot of military effort here because it sits equidistant between RSF strongholds in Darfur and army-held states in the east. The ugly truth is that Sudan's drone war is not this clean military duel. Much like we've seen in Ukraine, it's increasingly a civilian killing system. The United Nations is reports by Reuters, which is saying that drone strikes caused 80% of conflict-related civilian deaths in the first 4 months of this year. At least 880 civilians killed by unmanned aerial vehicles. And that is corroborated by a couple of different sources. So, the number's hard. Reuters also reported UN concern over failed drone strikes on civilians in Kordofan, including strikes around Al-Quds and El Beid on May 8th of this year. A lot of drone strikes launched from SAF have been killing civilians in North Kordofan. Other drone strikes are killing civilians elsewhere. All of this underscoring that both sides are implicated in a lot of drone-enabled civilian harm. There's no discrimination. I will say this. I think that this is an opinion, mind you. I feel as if the preponderance of the one-way drones launched out of Ukraine are targeting legitimate military targets. I cannot say that with certainty on the other side. I can't say with certainty on either. I am giving you my opinion. But in this case, in the Sudan conflict, it certainly feels like they don't have the targeting discipline, or maybe just they don't have the morality to give a shit what civilian casualties are at. And that, I think that is the central moral and military reality here, is that cheap aerial reach in a collapsing state, it doesn't produce precision. It produces terror. The food, the famine, and the drone pressure all contribute to make this war on survival systems critical. Farms, roads, markets, fuel, water, hospital, and aid corridors, they're now all part of the battlefield because of drones. This technology, it almost asymmetricalizes, I don't know if I can do that with that word, but I just did, any conflict, because there's no longer any linear lines. There's not a front. There is no behind. I think the United States realizes it. I think we're changing the paradigm of how we look at conflict and battles. The Marine Corps, I know, is certainly adapting itself towards that new paradigm of conflict. But Reuters reported that the Iran conflict has raised fuel and fertilizer costs, worsening Sudan's agricultural crisis at the same time that this civil war has completely devastated farming zones. They have built about 19.5 million people, which all face crisis-level hunger. That's pretty serious. Food production supplies are going to continue to drop because of this violence, because of this continued cost pressure. So, we have talked about the Iran conflict having ripples that are far-reaching, and this is where one of those ripples are definitely making a bad situation much, much worse. Drones are making the food crisis worse. They're hitting markets and roads, fuel depots, as well as aid nodes. They also create a lot of fear. Farmers don't want to plant crops. Truckers don't want to drive. Aid convoys don't want to move. And then a lot of civilians don't want to gather safely at the markets. In this case, I think famine does not always arrive as an empty field. Sometimes It's a buzzing sound overhead and a road that nobody wants to use. This drone war is not a separate chapter. It is the next chapter of Sudan's history, unfortunately. I think the old war model in this country was state neglect, followed by rebellion, militia mobilization, atrocity, foreign pressure, some kind of incomplete settlement, and then a new armed elite. I think now the new model is the state collapses, dual armed sovereignty, foreign drone supply, civilian infrastructure strike, de facto partition, and then proxy entrenchment. The strategic implications, I think there's a few. Sudan's probably going to partition in practice. They're not going to formally split tomorrow, but this war is creating a lot of functional partition. Right now, the SAF holds or at least contests much of the north, east, and parts of the center. RSF dominates or contests large parts of Darfur and Kordofan. And then drones are helping both sides defend and project across these zones, which means any future peace deal may not restore one state. It may just freeze a broken one, right? RSF drone capacity, it changes the militia model globally. Other militias are going to look and are looking at what is taking place in Sudan as a blueprint for asymmetrical warfare from militia groups like this. They're demonstrating that they can gain strategic strike effects without having a traditional air force. That lesson, believe me, that's being studied by armed groups all across Africa and the Middle East. This formula that they're using, it's portable. Commercial drones, imported military drones, foreign technicians, smuggled parts, the weak air defense, all under the umbrella of political deniability. That's a pretty dangerous exploit. Look for it in a conflict zone near you. The Red Sea, now part of the war. Port Sudan's vulnerability ties the civil war to a Red Sea security. So if aid corridors, ports, fuel depots, maritime logistics, if they're repeatedly hit, Sudan becomes part of the broader Red Sea instability picture, not just an isolated humanitarian island. The arms embargoes are being exposed as pretty weak here. The arms embargo has not stopped any of these advanced systems from appearing in the theater. Reuters and civil rights groups continue to document foreign weapons, foreign drones, suspected supply networks, despite a lot of international restrictions. I mean, we're in amongst them, right? It's not shaping battlefield behavior enough. It's really just recording violations after the fact. And I think civilian deaths are going to remain structurally high. I think drone warfare in Sudan is not being conducted under a lot of strong command discipline. As I said, I don't think they're having a robust target verification or any accountability. That means that civilian casualties, and as I mentioned, they're not an anomaly. They're going to continue to skyrocket. I see three forecasts for this. The most likely course is the war continues as a fragmented conflict with a lot of drone strikes concentrated in Kordofan, Darfur, Khartoum, and infrastructure nodes. Both sides are going to use drones to offset each other's weaknesses. For example, SAF is going to strike RSF mobile forces, a lot of their rear areas. RSF is going to compensate for a lack of air power and pressure against SAF-held cities. The most dangerous co-op. Foreign supply for these drones escalates. They get longer range drones, heavier payloads, more loitering munitions, possibly better air defense with counter-drone technology, and probably more foreign technicians or contractors. As long as there's money, somebody's going to go. That's going to make Sudan a deeper proxy battlefield. It's going to raise the odds of cross-border escalation with Chad, Egypt, Ethiopia, Libya, South Sudan, or Red Sea. The most ignored course of action Sudan drifts into a Somalia-Libya style fragmentation. So no decisive victor, multiple armed administrations, localized economies, gold routes, permanent humanitarian collapse, and drones become the enforcement tool of that fragmentation. So bottom line here, the Sudanese Civil War is the bill coming due for decades of militarized rule. The Bashir armed the margins to protect the center. The margins built their own power. The revolution removed the dictator, but not the war machine. The army and RSF could not coexist inside of one state. Foreign powers see an opportunity, and now drones have turned the battlefield into a killing grid. So this is not merely a war between two sides, Burhan and Hamedi. It is Sudan's unresolved history, one of Darfur, dictatorship, gold, patronage, foreign meddling, and state failure, now flying overhead in the form of armed drones. The new sound of war is no longer just artillery in the distance. It is a small engine above a market, a hospital, a school, a fuel depot, a road full of displaced families. And that is how a state dies in the drone age. Not all at once, but strike by strike, until the map still says Sudan, but the ground says something else. Pretty bleak, and a pretty ugly chapter to what has been a pretty ugly chapter for that country. Casualty figures, as just some caveats to this story, they're likely undercounted. A lot of access to that country is restricted. And then attribution for individual drone strikes is often disputed. Foreign involvement is real as a strategic pattern, but specific allegations, especially against states, this requires a lot of careful sourcing because every belligerent uses IO campaigns as part of the fight. Okay. So the next three stories, as I mentioned in the beginning, are going to revolve around, well, two of them are going to revolve around firearms. One of them is going to revolve around something that is regulated and it's finding its way into the hands of people who may or may not understand how to wield them. We'll get to it in a minute. I want to mention a story that revolves around the United States Postal Service and revising its ban on mailing handguns. If you didn't know, heretofore, in most instances, you could use the U.S. Postal Service to mail what is classified as a long gun. So a shotgun or a rifle, you can send it to somebody for repair. You can send it to if you're a private citizen, to a dealer who would then sell it on your behalf, or a pawn shop. The fact is without a license, meaning you're not a weapons dealer, you could typically ship long guns through the mail, but not handguns or a weapon that could be concealed. And that's starting to change, or at least they're going to revise it. So the U.S. Postal Service handgun ban has not simply been lifted yet. The accurate picture is like this. USPS has proposed a rule to revise the law so lawful handguns and other constitutionally protected firearms can be mailed under conditions similar to rifles and shotguns. Now, this proposal was published in the Federal Register on April 2nd. Public comments were due May 4th. Postal Service is saying it is acting because the DOJ, Department of Justice, Office of Legal Counsel, concluded that the 1927 federal law barring most concealable firearms from the mail is now unconstitutional as applied to constitutionally protected firearms. This is not mainly a postal policy change. It is a Second Amendment test case being pushed through an administrative channel. The Postal Service is not independently deciding that mailing handguns is a good idea. It is deferring to the Department of Justice's counsel opinion, which is arguing that the federal government cannot operate a partial system while refusing to carry constitutionally protected arms for law-abiding citizens. It's an interesting legal maneuver, and I think it only exists in light of some very robust Supreme Court legal rulings that have taken place in the last 10 to 15 years. All of this is surrounding 18 U.S. Code 1715, enacted, as I said, back in 1927. Now, that statute made pistols, revolvers, and other firearms capable of being concealed on the person generally non-mailable, with exceptions for licensed manufacturers, dealers, importers, as well as certain official government uses. DOJ's Office of Legal Counsel is now saying that restriction violates the Second Amendment under the post-Gruen legal framework, because handguns are now protected arms and because DOJ sees no adequate historical analog for a blanket postal ban. The post office's proposed rule is going to create two buckets: mailable firearms and non-mailable firearms. Lawful handguns would move into the mailable firearm category, while firearms outside constitutional protection or otherwise prohibited, like machine guns and certain restricted weapons, would remain non-mailable under this new proposed standard. The Post Office also states that mailers must still comply with the Gun Control Act, ATF regulations, as well as state and local laws. Got it. Don't worry, the political fight on this topic is already forming. Around 24 Democratic attorneys, at least 24 at the time I gathered this story to share with you, oppose the change, arguing that the executive branch cannot nullify a statute Congress passed, and that the change would undermine state background checks, permitting, and transfer laws. I don't know if that's accurate or not. I am simply reporting what has been reported. That is a detail that is going to have to be fleshed out in the next weeks and months as the story develops. Gun rights groups support the direction of travel. However, some are arguing the proposal still wraps lawful owners in too much compliance tapes. So what actually changes? Well, handguns could be mailed more like long guns. Under current practices, rifles and shotguns can already be mailed under specific conditions, including rule for interstate shipments between licensed federal firearms dealers and from non-federal firearms dealers to FFL dealers. The proposed rule would extend similar treatment to lawful handguns. Simple. The Post Office says that handguns would be mailed under the same general terms as rifles and shotguns, which means you have to ship them unloaded, securely packaged, no external markings that denote what's inside, and you have to have tracking and signature capture unless shipped between licensed dealers, manufacturers, or importers. Non-FFL holders, those are individuals who have a license to sell, manufacture, import, things like that. So regular civilians, right, could mail some firearms interstate. The rule would allow mailable firearms intended for delivery within the same state, subject to state, territory, or district rules, as long as they have return service requested, tracking and signature requirements included. I think that matters because private in-state transfers are regulated differently across states. Some require background checks, some do not. We're going to unpack a lot of those nuances in a separate standalone firearms law episode in the future. I've got it in my head. Non-federal firearms license owners could mail firearms to themselves out of state. For out-of-state mailing by non-FFL owners, this new rule would allow a person to mail a mailable firearm to themselves or another person in another state for lawful activities using an in the care of endorsement. Package must be opened by the recipient, must use tracking signature capture. So far, so good. The Associated Press reports that this is intended to support lawful travel for recreation or similar purposes, not to create an interstate private sale pipeline. So if you are going on a hunting trip and for whatever reason you choose not to fly with your firearm, and I'm not talking about in the cabin. I know we have a wide group of listeners. Understand you can check a firearm as a checked bag. There's lots of rules, but the airlines allow it, even internationally. This would add the ability to basically send something through the mail. You would pick it up at the other end. Okay. It would allow non-FFL holders to mail handguns to an FFL. Never been able to do that before. So if you want to mail a handgun to a dealer to have gunsmithing work done or whatever, maybe to sell, manufacture, or import, you could. Again, tracking, signature capture. This is really helpful for repairs and returns and transfers through dealers and lawful commerce. It's never been able to be done before. You always had to ship handguns through private carriers. So FedEx, UPS, DHL, and each one has their own nuanced requirements for handling that. Okay, great. For most of us, you probably don't care about this story. So why is this happening? Well, the Supreme Court case, the Bruin decision, it forced the courts to judge modern handgun restrictions against the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. So regardless of whether or not you necessarily care about firearms or maybe you're anti-Second Amendment, that's irrelevant. What I'm really trying to help unpack here is how the Supreme Court's decision is now matriculating down into this very interesting region of the U.S. government, Postal Service. Reuters notes that this lawsuit, the Bruin case, challenging the postal handgun mailing ban, is part of a broader wave of post-Bruin challenges to a lot of the firearms laws that are on the books in the United States. The Department of Justice legal counsel opinion is arguing that handguns are core protected arms and that the postal ban substantially burdens lawful transport, acquisition, and maintenance of those arms. The opinion specifically says the Department of Justice should stop prosecuting violations of this 1927 law for constitutionally protected firearms, and that the post office should conform its regulations to that constitutional view. A lot of private carriers restrict firearm shipments, and the Department of Justice is pointing to this modern shipping market. In its opinion, it notes that major express carriers restrict firearm shipments largely to FFLs or approved account holders, and DHL does not accept firearms under the cited policy. This means that for ordinary citizens, DOJ sees the postal ban as functionally closing off the ability to lawfully ship concealable firearms, handguns in this case. The Associated Press similarly reports that UPS and FedEx restrict gun shipments to customers with federal firearms licenses or approved arrangements, which would make the Postal Service the key shipping channel if this rule takes effect. Great. Gun rights groups are really forcing the issue here. Gun Owners of America and the Gun Owners Foundation both sued the post office back in 2025. They argued that the nearly century-old handgun mailing ban violates the Second Amendment. Reuters reports names the case was Shreve versus U.S. Postal Service. It was filed in Western District of Pennsylvania. Now, the lawsuit did not by itself lift the ban, but it did put pressure on the federal government, and the Department of Justice's legal counsel opinion gave the administration this legal theory to stop enforcing the old rule against protected firearms. What does the opposition say? Because I do want to present both sides, right? The state's attorney generals are not making a soft public safety complaint. Their legal argument in this case is much, much harder. The U.S. Postal Service and the Department of Justice are trying to accomplish by executive interpretation what only Congress or a court can do. The multi-state comment letter. It argues the proposed rule is ultra vires and contrary to law because 1715 U.S. Code, it remains on the books. It's not been struck down by any court. So it's arguing that the legal counsel from the Department of Justice cannot directly tell the Postal Service to violate a facially valid statute. The current law channels handgun shipments through licensed dealers rather than banning all transport. Excuse me. So their argument is that the direct mailing of handguns could potentially bypass a lot of state systems that require a background check, safety courses, permits, or mental health history checks for certain transfers. That's wonky. Yes, I see their point, and we'll just leave it at that. The Associated Press reports the attorneys general warned this rule could make it easier for prohibited people to include felons and domestic abusers to access firearms and make it harder for law enforcement to solve gun crimes. The Trace highlights another enforcement problem. The rule would require tracking, signature delivery, and nondescript packaging. But stolen packages, failed signature discipline, and a broken chain of custody events could create tracing problems. Okay. Now, the gun rights argument. So the gun right argument here is very, very simple. A constitutional right that cannot be transported, repaired, shipped, or received is being strangled by logistics. The Department of Justice opinion is framing 1715 as a substantial burden on lawful self-defense, target shooting, hunting, acquisition, and repair because it blocks ordinary citizens from mailing handguns even when they are unloaded and even when the intended purpose is lawful. NRA publicly praised the ban as a victory for law-abiding gun owners. It argued that the Postal Service would finally treat handguns under similar safety conditions as rifles and shotguns. There's arguments on both sides. You decide. Gun Owners of America, another pro-Second Amendment group, supports the direction but says that the proposal may not go far enough, calling it a complex web of regulations rather than a clean Second Amendment win. So what does all of this apply? Well, I think that the executive branch is really stress testing a lot of these old gun laws, and this is a big one. The Department of Justice is not waiting for the Supreme Court to strike down 1715. Again, 1715 is U.S. Code. It is declaring through the Office of Legal Counsel that DOJ should not enforce it against protected firearms. That is very aggressive executive constitutionalism. It will invite a lot of legal challenges because Congress is the one that passed the statute and the judiciary has not yet invalidated it. There is so much to this. You have prosecutorial discretion. They don't have to prosecute, but yet it's a law in the books, and it's a pretty big one, passed by Congress, and it has been in place for almost 100 years. It's going to be a fight. If this rule takes effect, the post office could become the only major accessible parcel channel for ordinary handgun owners because private carriers have narrowed firearms shipping to FFLs, license holders, or approved accounts. And that shifts the risk from private carrier compliance to postal clerks, postal inspectors, delivery carriers, and local law enforcement. I have no idea what the woman or man postal carrier feels about this. I don't know. I will tell you that I would be willing to bet the preponderance of the firearms that a postal carrier has laid hands on completely unknown to them. That would be my assumption. I have not personally interviewed every single postal carrier from sea to shining sea, but that's my assessment. A lot of state gun control regimes are going to face a federal bypass problem because of this. So states with universal background checks, private transfer rules, waiting periods, or licensing requirements, they're going to see this as a breach in the wall. The Postal Service says mailers must still obey federal, state, and local laws. And yeah, but critics argue the system depends heavily on self-certification and after-the-fact enforcement. Criminal misuse, yeah, there is a risk. It does rise at the margins, but not evenly. You know, the alarmist version says that the Postal Service becomes a gun trafficking pipeline. I think that's really overstated if the final rule requires tracking and signatures, no firearms markings on the outside, and you still have to comply with all of the gun control acts already on the book. But the other side of that is intellectually dishonest as well. More lawful mailability means more total firearms in the mail stream, and more volume means more opportunities for theft, false declarations, straw transfers, and enforcement gaps. It's not a clean argument on either side. And I think ultimately the courts are going to be the decisive arbiter here, as they should be. I would expect lawsuits from states, gun control groups, or both, frankly, if the post office finalizes the rule. The core legal question will be whether an executive agency can revise its regulations in defiance of a still existing statute, strictly based off of a legal counsel constitutional opinion. I think the secondary question here is whether 1715 survives the Bruin historical tradition test. We'll see. Congress also gets a vote. They may try to relock the door. Representative Hallie Stevens introduced legislation to block the post office's plan and keep handgun mailing limited to federally licensed dealers and then similar authorized channels. And that effort shows the fight's already moving from agency rulemaking into Congress. And I think that's probably where it should lie. That is my opinion, of course. The bottom line, this is not a small shipping rule tweak. It is a fight over whether the Second Amendment includes the practical logistics of ownership, such as shipment, repair, transfer, and travel. The administration's position is pretty clear. You cannot say handguns are constitutionally protected, then make lawful citizens unable to move them through the national parcel system. The opposing view, you cannot use a Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel memo to blow a hole through a 1927 statute and state-level gun control systems without Congress or the court. My read on all of this, the USPS can probably finalize some version of this rule, but the cleanest version is not going to survive unchallenged. The immediate battlefield here is straight up administrative law. The deeper battlefield is the post-Bruin Second Amendment doctrine. And the operational battlefield is the chain of custody inside the mail stream. The old way of doing business, very, very simple. Handguns mostly stayed out of the post office unless shipped through a dealer or official channels. The new order, if finalized, is a lot messier. More lawful access, more legal ambiguity, more enforcement burden, and a lot more litigation. So that's the trade. Liberty expands, control degrades, system gets a lot louder. We will follow up on this story because it is not going away. Expect to talk about this in the next couple of months. Oh, and by the way, the rule that I'm discussing was published as a proposed rule. It's not a fully settled final regime. The public comments closed on May the 4th. The post office says it is reviewing all of these comments before finalizing any change. Oh, and please, I would be remiss if I did not look you straight in the eye and say this very, very clearly. I am not a lawyer. Nothing I said is considered to be legal advice. Anyone mailing a firearm still faces federal, state, local, post office, and ATF requirements, and violations can carry a serious criminal exposure. So do not use me as justification for doing something. Don't do it. The post office itself has said postmasters are not authorized to give legal opinions, and anyone who wants to mail a firearm should seek guidance to the ATF for any legal questions. Now, all that being said, I am a federally firearms licensee, Class 7, Class 2, and SOT. So, having held a license for the last 10 years, I am somewhat familiar with this, but I am not giving any legal advice, and I should not be counted upon to do it. All right. Next story. This one's fun. I came across this a couple of weeks ago, and I've been sitting on it. It's not time sensitive, so now's my chance to unwrap it. And it features Alibaba. I have never bought anything off Alibaba. I am scared. I think it's all a scam. Many people I've spoken to have. But I will tell you what I like to do. I like to scroll Alibaba. So when this story came up, I went, no shit. Okay, let me go see if these are actually being sold. Okay, what am I talking about? High-powered laser weapons. Sort of. The regulations in the United States for lasers, there are limits on what can commercially be sold as far as power ratings, and they come with warnings. And if you're not really that up to scratch on technology, don't point lasers in your eyes and all that thing. Kind of goes out the window when you buy something on the internet. The retailer has no burden of responsibility if you misuse the device. So Alibaba is selling some pretty high-powered laser, what do I call them? Weapons? Can we call them weapons just for the sake of this story? Now, they're not literally acting like an arms dealer selling battlefield laser rifles from a warehouse. The more precise picture here is unfortunately a little bit uglier. Alibaba.com is hosting third-party listings for handheld or portable high-power laser systems marketed as obstacle removers, welding guns, cleaning tools, igniters, laser pointers, or laser rifles. Some listings appear framed for industrial use, but the form factor, power claims, low price, and low minimum order quantity, as well as very weak buyer gating, create this gray market access channel for devices that can really blind you, burn, damage cameras and optics, threaten aircraft, and be repurposed as coercive tools. Now, I'm not being silly. This is not Star Wars on the street. It's not a practical battlefield rifle, but this is a very cheap directed energy harassment and injury tool. It's all leaking from industrial supply chains into a lot of consumer accessible e-commerce. This article comes from Futurism, by the way. It was May of this year, and Alibaba listings include handheld laser devices such as a 400 watt to 500 watt handheld laser obstacle remover machine. Ridiculous. These things are priced around $800 to $1,200. A 1 kilowatt remote controlled igniter around $1,600. Folks, if you're not familiar with lasers and wattage and power ratings, that is freaking powerful. Yeah. The article frames these as easily accessible, high-power devices, a lot of potential to cause permanent eye damage. Now, I may or may not have used lasers on the battlefield as a direct fire weapon in direct violation of the Geneva Convention. I said I may. I'm not admitting anything. And the statute of limitations is expired anyways. Direct Alibaba search results, and I tried this. They also show categories like high-powered laser gun, laser beam gun, laser rifle. Look it up. And handheld fiber laser welding and cleaning equipment, including advertised in the 100, 1,000, 1,500, and 2,000 watt classes. Now, some of these are clearly marked industrial tools. Some are marketed with language that drifts into the gun, rifle, weapon, tactical, survival presentation. Food and Drug Administration's already warned that internet-sold products may be overpowered, unsafe, non-compliant, or intended only for trained or licensed users, and that a lot of illegal imports may be refused, returned, or destroyed. Customs and Border Protection, the port authorities, they look to this stuff. Bottom line, this story, it's not that Alibaba has somehow invented a new weapon. The story really, for me, is more about that global business-to-business marketplaces are collapsing the wall between industrial laser tools and consumer accessible weapons adjacent devices. So there's a couple of different overlapping categories that appear to be selling. You have industrial handheld lasers for welding, cutting, cleaning, rust removal, marking. Legitimate versions exist in manufacturing. Heck, I have one myself. And it was expensive, and it requires a lot of setup and a lot of trial and error. So I get it. These are for manufacturing, construction, agricultural, and utility contexts. The problem is that once a high-power laser like this becomes handheld, and that's what they're making them, portable, very cheap, plus you're shipping them across borders with minimal vetting, it's legitimate industrial identity. That becomes the cover story. These obstacle removal lasers is the second category, and this is especially concerning. I feel the term can refer to devices marketed for burning, cutting, or removing material from a distance. That's not a normal consumer product. That's a portable thermal energy projector with a lot of obvious misuse potential. I know. Then there's the high-power pointer or tactical lasers. These are the ones that are sometimes referred to as dazzlers. Alibaba, their pages and buying guides include a lot of high-power laser pointers marketed far above anything you would use for presenting a PowerPoint. In fact, their own guide language describes high-power pointers as devices above 5 milliwatts and notes that lasers above 500 milliwatts fall into the highest hazard class under ANSI-style classification frameworks. So any laser you get, it's going to have that glaring sticker with a bunch of warning on it. That's an international marking classification. International, whether it's a pair of NVGs, a laser pointer, it doesn't matter what it is. These are pretty high up there in the pointers realm, right? Like far beyond pointers. The fourth classification of things that I've come across and that the article highlighted was the laser rifle. These listings included words like toy, tactical, gun, rifle, or a lot of weapon adjacent language. And this is where this market becomes intentionally slippery, right? A device may be listed as a toy or a tool or a handheld welder or a cleaning gun or an obstacle remover. Don't know what the hell that is. But the visual grammar says something else. It has a pistol grip, rifle shape, a trigger, a shoulder stock, and a lot of tactical casings. So how are they getting away with this? They're doing it through classification laundering, not money laundering, not necessarily illegal arms trafficking in the classic sense. I'm talking about classification laundering. You've seen it. You have a seller who takes a dangerous or dual-use device, places it under a softer label. That lets the device pass through search or customs or platform policy for the website and buyer psychology as equipment instead of a weapon. And the platform effect matters. Alibaba is a global B2B marketplace, not a very tightly controlled arms export portal. Sellers can exploit a lot of broad industrial categories like this. You have a lot of loose keywords, multilingual listings, and let's face it, inconsistent enforcement. And the low minimum order quantities, this means a buyer doesn't need to be a factory or a state actor to acquire one. Some of these are like individuals. And that's the gap, right? In the US, laser products are regulated under federal performance standards. So the ECFR defines class 4 lasers as devices permitting human access to laser radiation above the class 3B accessible limit. I get it. This is wonky, but just bear with me. So the Food and Drug Administration says some internet sold laser products shouldn't be available to the general public because they could be overpowered and maybe intended only for trained personnel or licensed medical professionals or other approved users. It also says imported illegal products will probably be refused entry, returned, or destroyed. There's huge risk to aviation here, and it's already been proven. The Federal Aviation Administration has recorded almost 14,000 laser strikes in 2023 alone. You had 1,300 in 2024. You had 1,225, and we're not even halfway through 26 yet, and we have almost 3,000. So they state that high-powered lasers can incapacitate pilots. Civil penalties are up to about $11,000 per violation, higher if you have multiple incidents. In Switzerland, the Office of Public Health states that possession, import, and the use of dangerous laser pointers are prohibited. A lot of countries flat out ban these. They specifically flag online sales of non-compliant devices, which are capable of serious eye and skin damage. And if it sounds like this story is nanny, I just said it was interesting. You can jump on Alibaba and do whatever you want. We're all grown adults here. The precedent that it makes is sort of one that is dovetailing nicely into some of the topics that we have covered in past episodes, which is the third party and their ability to sell. Sometimes it's drone parts, sometimes it is weapons parts anonymously without reprisal because of this classification laundering that we're speaking about. Many Alibaba devices are not advertised as blinding laser weapons. They are advertised as tools, and that's the gap, because the law controls declared purpose or power classes or labeling or import compliance and misuse, right? But e-commerce exploits all of this ambiguity before enforcement catches up. Why does this matter militarily? Well, don't confuse these devices with real military-directed energy weapons. That's not what I'm saying. U.S. Department of Defense spends roughly $1 billion annually on directed energy weapons development. That's according to the Government Accountability Office. Because a lot of these high-energy lasers and microwaves offer speed of light engagement and a lot of lower cost shot than kinetic interceptors for drones, right? But the Government Accountability Office also notes DoD has struggled to transition these systems from demonstration into fielded capability. Because real military lasers require a lot of power, beam control, thermal management. You've got other systems to help with tracking, safety, atmospheric compensation. And then you have to integrate them into some kind of a kill chain, right? The Army's directed energy air defense work, for example, involves vehicle-mounted systems, live fire exercises, and tactical developments against drone threats, not handheld ray guns. So these Alibaba devices that I'm speaking about, they're not Dragonfire or Iron Beam or naval counter-drone lasers, but they're dangerous in a different way. Low cost, deniable, easy to source, optical harassment, injury. Likely misuse is not shooting down aircraft. I get that, but you can blind and dazzle pilots. drivers, police, security personnel, damaged cameras, drones, surveillance equipment, or just straight up harass, right? Again, if it seems as if I am somehow taking a left turn into um, clutching my pearls, no, the lasers happen to be the focus of the story, but the platform and the mechanism by which they're being distributed lends itself towards a wide range of other nefarious items. So I want to place it in this category because we're going to come back to it. Really, this is kind of asymmetric nuisance warfare, right? It's got cheap tool, it's a high fear, and there's a lot of ambiguous attribution. So the internet, we're all familiar with it. It's always provided a dual use bazaar, if you will, or marketplace. And this same marketplace logic moves drones, night vision, body armor, radios, and a lot of 3D printed parts into the broad civilian circulation. And now it is touching directed energy tools. And not all of it is illegal. I admit that. That's exactly the problem. That's exactly the problem, is that this marketplace lives in the gray. Customs enforcement, horribly outmatched, right? A firearm looks like a firearm. A high-power laser can be declared as a welder or cleaner, igniter, a scientific tool, or just a replacement part. So a lot of the enforcement here, it depends on classification or labeling or power output, as well as the local law. It's a lot to inspect at a partial scale. We just talked about the post office, touches it again, right? I think as a lot more of these things find their way into the public aviation and public safety risk, I think it goes way up. The more powerful the device pushes the risk curve in the wrong direction. A lot of these platforms like Alibaba are always going to hide behind third-party seller architecture. They can say they're a marketplace, and sellers can say these are industrial tools, and buyers can even say that they're hobbyists for businesses, and everyone points at someone else. But meanwhile, this device is moving through commerce. And the treaty regime that we have in place, that other countries have in place, it's completely outdated for e-commerce, right? Protocol 4 built around state transfer and battlefield blinding weapons. It was not designed for a world where a non-state buyer can search a marketplace, contact a supplier, and import high-power laser under industrial label. It's optics in many ways, right? It is. Modern militaries or airports, police ports, they're all saturated with cameras. We all have safe cities and smart cities. We have sensors and drones and rangefinders and optical sights. Lasers attack that entire visual layer. They don't need to kill the matter. They just need to blind the system at the wrong moment. Bottom line on this story is that Alibaba is not selling death rays, nor am I claiming. What is happening is a little more serious, and I think it's a little more mundane. Portable industrial laser technology is bleeding into the open market under a lot of soft label, cheap pricing, and very weak platform enforcement. And we end up with civilian accessible, directed energy hazard that sits right below the threshold of traditional arms control, but above the threshold of ordinary consumer safety. It is a public safety, it is an aviation, it is a customs, platform governance, and gray zone procurement problem. And look, the danger here is not that every idiot gets a laser cannon. The danger is that one idiot only needs one. I'm certain there are some of you who are going to find the hypocrisy over the last story and this story shocking, but I'd be happy to argue that one in the future. A couple of caveats on that story. Some of these devices do have legitimate applications, and there's no evidence to prove that Alibaba corporate intends to sell weapons. It just shows a market enforcement failure. A lot of third-party supplier exploitation of what's already in place. And then any seller market claims should be treated with a little skepticism. In this market, in this day and age, overstatement and dangerous understatings are very, very common. Okay, that brings us to our final story. And then we're going to wrap it up for the evening. This is a story about firearms again. It is around another very highly emotionally charged topic that is one of home manufactured weapons. I truly will be discussing this further. I will say, though, that for this story, you need to understand that from the very beginning, all of you who are U.S. citizens and otherwise lawfully eligible to own a firearm, you can make them at home, provided you aren't selling them. There's some other details we can talk about in the future, but knowing homemade firearms are legal in most cases, I want to share a story regarding what I see as a very slippery slope, and that is the digital files used to print 3D firearms and the government's attempt to regulate or outright ban them. I am not going to get into my personal opinions in this forum about whether I support or condemn what's taking place, but I want to present the story because I think it's a good discussion. This will get a little bit wonky here, so bear with me just a little, and then we'll come right back up to the 30,000-foot view. Understand also, this is not a story that is uniquely American. Every person globally who can plug in a 3D printer and has an internet connection is affected at some point. So let's check it out. The government has had U.S. government anyways, has had a ghost gun battle for quite a while. And it shifted from whether Washington can regulate build-it-yourself gun kits to how far the government can chase decentralized weapons manufacturing. Once the weapon is no longer just a kit, but a file, a printer, a polymer frame, a conversion device, as well as an online subculture. If you are not aware, you have the ability to purchase a 3D printer and then open source, download code, G-code, to print a firearm. It's an oversimplification. There's a little more to it than that, and I am, again, not going to offer any legal advice or what the rules are in your particular location. I'm just telling you what is physically capable of being done. So the government, at least in 2 states, are currently enacting legislation that would either heavily restrict or in some cases outright ban at the state level owning the digital G code that prints these files or prints the gun parts, owning the files, owning anything related to it. So the whole chain they're trying to either heavily restrict or in some cases outright ban. It's an interesting problem. Can you do that? Can you legally, under the amendments in America, restrict digital knowledge, digital content, even if you don't print? The federal government won a big legal hill in Bondi versus Vanderstock. In March of last year, the Supreme Court upheld the ATF's 2022 ghost gun rule in a 7-2 decision, which allows the ATF to treat certain weapons parts kits and unfinished frames and receivers as firearms under the Gun Control Act, which means that serialization, licensing, record keeping, and background check requirements all apply. Okay, but that's not the end of the fight. It's just the end of round 1. The battle currently has 4 fronts. First is federal regulation. So ATF's frame receiver rule remains the central federal weapon against commercial ghost gun kits. Second is court warfare. The gun rights groups are still attacking the rule through narrower lawsuits and a lot of constitutional arguments. Third front is state experimentation. A lot of states are moving beyond gun kits and now into the 3D printer digital firearm files and software control. For technological adaptation, the threat is migrating from polymer 80 style kits towards 3D printed firearms, hybrid firearms, and small printed conversion devices. So the hard truth is the government can regulate companies, licensed dealers, and commercial kit sellers. It has a much harder time regulating files, printers, the decentralized online communities that aggregate these files, and then the basement level manufacturing. And that's really the center of gravity. Why is this currently happening? This article was not the only article that I was looking at in creating this story for this evening. The ATF's 2022 frame or receiver final rule was designed to close the build kit loophole. If you're not familiar, these are kits that make it easier for a individual in the privacy of their own home to build a gun from raw materials. It included everything you need for the most part. Since 2022, that has changed pretty drastically. The ATF says the rule's purpose is to ensure that you have proper marking, record keeping, and traceability for all firearms manufactured, imported, acquired of, or disposed of by a federal firearms licensee. But it also defined terms such as privately made firearm, readily made, frame, receiver, terms that didn't keep up with modern tooling, manufacturing, and technology. So the Supreme Court upheld that approach. It rejected the broad argument that the ATF could never regulate parts kits or incomplete frames under the Gun Control Act. Reuters reported that the rule requires manufacturers of qualifying kits and parts to mark them now with serial numbers. They had to obtain licenses to do it. They had to run background checks on purchasers. So the bottom line that the ruling showed was that the federal government can still regulate many ghost gun kits just like firearms. But that decision was not a blank check. It was narrow enough to leave room for future attacks against specific applications in the rule. And I think that is what you are going to find with the 3D printed technology. The legal fight still very much alive. Gun rights groups didn't pack up and leave the field. The Second Amendment Foundation, as well as Defense Distributed, filed a May of this year motion for a summary judgment into Defense Distributed versus Blanche, and they are continuing to challenge the ATF's frame and receiver rule. I think that matters because the Supreme Court ruling mostly settled the facial statutory question, which is whether the ATF had authority to regulate at least some kits. Did not permanently settle every as-applied First Amendment, Second Amendment, or Administrative Procedure Act. So there's a legal fight still out there. Duke's Center for Firearms Law noted that state ghost gun laws may face constitutional challenges after ban of stock, especially because state laws are statutes rather than federal agency rules, which makes litigation terrain very, very difficult. To translate that into something a little simpler, the government won the main authority fight, but a lot of the perimeter is very much still contested. The Trump-era Department of Justice / ATF posture is much more deregulatory. The ghost gun rule still stands, but in April, both DOJ and ATF announced a very broad regulatory reform package. 34 notices of final and proposed rulemaking aimed at reducing burdens on lawful gun owners and businesses, all following executive orders on Second Amendment rights. Department of Justice framing this as a modernization, burden reduction, just trying to get itself aligned with new court rulings. If you go to ATF's website, as a matter of fact, their new era of reform page talks about how the agency has shifted towards much more transparency, accountability, partnering with industry, and grounding actions in clear statute authority. So the ATF, very contentious organization in many respects and needed in others. I'm not going to weigh in on my opinion as to what the efficacy of the ATF is, but they haven't had a Senate appointed director for long periods of time. In fact, the position wasn't even required to be Senate confirmed until 2006. And then since then, they've historically operated under a near perpetual cycle of acting directors, all due to heavy political opposition surrounding gun control and federal firearms enforcement. So they had 7 years of no director. Between 2006 and 2013, they had no confirmed director before Jones was confirmed in 2013, and he was in place until 2015. And then once he stepped down, there was another 7 years of acting directors. But I digress. Anyways, so this whole rollback that the ATF is undergoing includes revisiting the engaged in the business dealer rule, removing the stabilizing brace language. ATF says that engaged in the business rule does not eliminate statutory enforcement against unlicensed dealing, clearly, because the underlying criminal prohibition remains in the Gun Control Act, but it is going to affect how home firearms are manufactured. It does not appear to have killed the ghost gun frame receiver rule because the ATF still maintains the rule page on their website and all the letters and compliance materials and so forth. This may not apply to everybody. It's probably not going to apply to the preponderance of the people listening. The story is bigger than just the subject. It is about whether or not the federal government can control information, ultimately. And that's how this is going to flesh out. So bear with me. The federal posture is split. We have more pro-gun rights tone, less regulatory aggression in some areas, but the Supreme Court-backed ghost gun rule remains completely operational unless it is, separately rescinded or narrowed by the ATF. So here's where the states come in. New York just moved into the next phase of regulating the tools and the code for manufacturing guns, not just the gun. New York New York recently approved a first-in-the-nation legislation which require 3D printers sold in New York to include blocking technology meant to prevent firearm or illegal component printing. And the bill would criminalize any possession or distribution of digital firearm manufacturing code. Now, that's a major escalation, folks. It shifts the fight from firearms law into software governance, manufacturing technology, AI moderation, digital speech, not to mention a huge surveillance risk. Oh, and enforcement. I don't know how they're going to do this. Enforcement is ugly. The Times Union reported that digital gun files may be hard to distinguish from ordinary geometric shapes because many printers use open source software. And New York's own officials acknowledge that technology is way ahead of the law. I think New York is trying to put a checkpoint on a road that no longer has gates. The earlier wave of ghost gun kits was dominated by build, shoot, right? So you get an unfinished frame, a receiver, a jig, the tools, and the parts are marketed in ways that allow buyers to assemble functional firearms without serial numbers or background checks. ATF's rule was aimed directly at that ecosystem. It made the kit market more legally dangerous for sellers and harder to operate openly. The new ghost gun problem, I'm not a huge fan of that word, but we're just going to use it in context because it fits. The new ghost gun problem is 3D printing and hybrid weapons. The emerging problem now is not a Glock style frame or AR lower. It is a printed frame, printed receivers, printed switches and conversion devices, hybrid guns that combine printed parts with metal barrels and commercial components. Not to mention downloadable CAD files, encrypted communities where these files are aggregated, possibly domestic extremist interests. I don't know. You have a lot of rapidly improving consumer grade printers. These are not hobbyists' machines anymore. These are available on Amazon. And within a week, you can get a printer sitting on your workbench, counter, wherever, that are capable of, printing out a firearm, which, again, I'm not making a pro or against argument for. That is not the forum for this today. I'm just passing on the information. ATF's own page lists a dedicated National Firearms Commerce and Trafficking Assessment section on privately made firearms. It's an interesting data set. It has data sets covering trends through 2024. It does caveat that they're still trying to improve collection methods as well as their data quality, but they had some interesting numbers. Internationally, Canada's public safety briefing states that ghost guns are unmarked, untraceable, and that it is already illegal in Canada to manufacture or possess any firearm, including a 3D printed firearm, without proper licensing. Well, we always knew that, Canada. Europol has also warned that 3D printed firearms are a current and future threat requiring international cooperation. This fight is not isolated. I told you that. The ghost gun problem is, according to some statistics, becoming a global additive manufacturing problem. So, what does it imply? Well, law enforcement gets traceability only in the commercial lane. So serialization helps when a gun passes through the regulated economy. It helps when there is a seller, a licensee, a transaction, a shipping record, a payment rail, or a recovery supply chain. It does much less when the weapon starts as a file and ends as a printed part in a garage. So the government's win is real, but it's very, very limited. It recovered ground in the market. It's not solving the manufacturing revolution. The fight, I think, is going to move from gun stores to platforms. And it's a worrisome fight, I think. And I'll tell you why at the end. You're going to expect a lot more governmental pressure on file sharing platforms, 3D printer manufacturers, slicer software providers, payment processors that are handling the transactions, shipping companies that are putting it out there, the online marketplaces that are selling them, not to mention the encrypted forums for some of these files and a lot of AI moderation systems. There's a constitutional collision here. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the crux of why I am putting this story in front of you. Hear me. The public safety versus speech, code, privacy, and decentralized manufacturing. Does the government have the constitutional authority to regulate speech, code, and privacy if it can justify public safety? We have not done that for the First Amendment heretofore. Red states and blue states are going to be split even harder over this. Blue states will likely pursue bans on unserialized firearms, digital blueprints, printer controls, and possession of unfinished parts. Conversely, red states will likely frame these efforts as overreach by the state and federal government, especially where the laws touch home manufacture or code possession or printer restrictions. I've seen two different ways that they're looking at possibly moderating this. Yes, definitely going upstream for the websites, whether they be domestic or offshore, where these files are being stored and disseminated. They're also talking about versions of 3D printers that are only available to be sold in their states, which would have built-in AI filtering tools at the hardware level that would screen anything coming into the machine's download before printed. Wow. Yeah. This becomes another front in this whole broader post-Bruin gun law battlefield, right? I think the worry here, it's not without worry, but criminals and extremists, they're going to adapt a lot faster than legislatures. Legislatures move in months and years, and online weapons communities iterate in days. A law against one kit design or one file type, all it does is push the ecosystem towards renaming files, distributing repositories, obfuscated geometry, modular components, of course, overseas hosting, or encrypted sharing. In addition to the hybrid build models that are already taking place, the opportunity cost for government is very, very high. If it keeps fighting the last version of the ghost gun, it loses the next one. The real operational requirement is intelligence fusion. The winning model is not only, you have to regulate, it is gun crime intelligence. That means that ATF, local police, fusion centers, postal inspectors, customs, digital investigators, prosecutors, and cyber units all need to share visibility on recovered privately made firearms, printer-linked evidence, online distribution networks, conversion device trafficking, extremist adoption, and then repeated purchasers of parts or short time to crime patterns. And no single agency owns this, and that's the problem. My forecast for how this is going to develop near term, I would say this year, ATF's ghost gun rule is going to remain in force, but I think a lot of gun right litigation is going to continue. There are going to be several states that push real hard into 3D printing and digital file regulation. Meanwhile, the courts are going to sort through whether these state laws survive the Second Amendment and speech-based challenges. I don't know if they will. Commercial midterm anyways, commercial ghost gun kits recovery is probably going to continue to decline. But I think 3D printed components and conversion devices are going to grow up. I think that's the new growth sector, additive manufacturing. It's huge. Long term, the government is never going to be able to eliminate ghost guns. Legally, they can't. There's a constitutional right to do it in many ways. I don't understand how they can regulate it to every nook and cranny, but really, they don't have to. The realistic objective here is degradation. You make mass commercialization much, much harder, which they've done. You increase forensic traceability. You've done. Punish trafficking networks. Weak, but it does get done. And disrupt high-risk actors before printed weapons move from novelty to routine criminal logistics. Now, they haven't at this point. At least the statistics that I have seen hasn't indicated yet. The bottom line is that the government won the legal permission to regulate ghost gun kits, but it has not won the war, and the battlefield has just moved. The old argument in this context was, is this unfinished frame legally a gun? The new fight, and this is what worries me, can the state control a weapon that begins as code, moves through a printer, avoids serialization, and lives inside decentralized online culture? That's a much harder target. No serial number, no storefront, no clean supply chain, just polymer, files, ideology, and intent. Yeah. I think I snuck a little more opinion into that last story than I felt like I should have, or was appropriate, or was certainly in keeping with my typical MO. But yeah, a couple of caveats I want you to understand. The current federal policy could change very, very quickly if DOJ or ATF rescinds or narrows any of the frame receivable, and litigation is still current and ongoing. State 3D printer and digital file laws are very, very new territory. They're largely untested. They are much likely to face serious constitutional challenges. That's the segments for this evening. I appreciate everybody stopping by and listening to the conversation. If you have enjoyed what has been said, drop me a line. If you don't, drop me a line too. Just do me the courtesy of explaining why. And let's have an argument. And an argument is a premise. An argument is a position. It is a statement. So make a statement. Brad at contact at bradcolbert.us. Until next time, I am Brad Colbert, the Iceman, reminding all of you to stay frosty.
Improvise, adapt, and overcome.